Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that you are the only person left on your entire island. No neighbors, no traffic outside your window, no supermarket a few minutes away, no restaurant, no school, no one casually walking past your house. Just wind, water, and several hundred acres of empty land. For most people, that sounds less like a home, and more like the beginning of a survival story. But there is a place where this isn't hypothetical. An island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, where an entire community once lived. Families raised children here. People farmed the land. They fished. They built homes. They created a community that survived for generations. At one point, roughly 180 people called this tiny island home. Today, there is just one regular resident. The island is called Boreray. And what makes Boreray fascinating isn't simply how isolated it is. It's the question of how an entire community disappeared, and why, decades after everyone else had left, someone decided to come back. Because when you look across Boreray today, you don't just see an empty island. You can still see the traces of the people who once lived here. Old walls, old buildings, old paths, old fields. Reminders that this place was once anything but empty. And somewhere among all of that, one person chose to make Boreray home again. So what happened? Why did everyone leave? And perhaps the strangest question of all, why would anyone choose to live here now? To understand that, we have to go back. Far to the northwest of mainland Britain lies the Outer Hebrides, a chain of islands scattered along the Atlantic coast. These islands are famous for dramatic landscapes. White beaches, green hills, rocky shores, ancient settlements, and weather that can change with almost no warning. But Boreray sits even farther into this world of isolation. It is a small island lying roughly 2 kilometers north of North Uist. The entire island covers only around 198 hectares, less than 2 square kilometers. Its highest point rises only about 56 meters above sea level. And today, there is just one croft and one regular inhabitant. But here's the strange part. If you arrived on Boreray without knowing its history, you might assume it had always been this quiet. It hasn't, because Boreray wasn't created as a place for one person. It was once home to a community, and not a tiny one. In the 1841 census, 181 people were recorded on the island. For much of the 19th century, more than 100 people lived here. Think about that. Today, one person, almost 200 years ago, roughly 180. So where did they all go? That's where Boreray's story really begins. Boreray has been occupied for a very long time. There are signs of human presence going back to prehistoric times. But the island's more recent story begins with the MacLean family, who owned Boreray from around the 15th century. Around 1810, the last MacLean of Boreray left the island. And something interesting happened after that. The land was divided into around 20 crofts, small agricultural holdings where individual families could work the land and try to make a living. The population grew rapidly. By 1841, 181 people were living here. That means that when you walk across Boreray today, you're not walking through a place that was simply occasionally inhabited. You're walking through what was once a real community. Imagine this island nearly 2 centuries ago. There would have been families living in small homes, people working the land, animals grazing, boats going out onto the surrounding waters, children growing up knowing almost every other family on the island. The landscape that looks empty today would have been filled with movement, smoke rising from chimneys, voices, animals, arguments, laughter, births, deaths, everything that makes a place feel like home. And the island had something else, a resource that helped sustain communities throughout parts of the Hebrides. Seaweed could be collected and processed into kelp ash, which had important industrial uses. For a time, the kelp industry was extremely valuable. But the same industry that had helped support island communities would eventually become part of the problem. The market collapsed. At the same time, Boraray's land was being heavily cultivated. The combination placed increasing pressure on an already difficult way of life. And slowly, Boreray began to lose people. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic event. One family, then another, then another. The young and able-bodied increasingly looked elsewhere. Some left for other parts of Scotland. Others went much farther. Canada, America. The island's population gradually began to shrink. And that is one of the most important things to understand about Boreray. The island wasn't suddenly abandoned. It was slowly emptied, one person at a time. Imagine what that must feel like. You grow up on an island where everyone knows everyone. Then people start leaving. Perhaps your cousin leaves. Then your neighbor. Then someone else's son. The school becomes quieter. The boats become fewer. The number of people available to work the land decreases. And eventually, the question changes. It isn't, why would anyone leave? How can anyone stay? By the early 20th century, the population had fallen dramatically. The people who remained were increasingly old. The younger generation had gone elsewhere. And the basic work required to keep a community alive was becoming harder to sustain. In the 1920s, the remaining community was eventually evacuated. The final transfer involved 19 families, around 50 people, who were moved to new holdings on North Uist. The people who remained had struggled to maintain a livelihood through crofting, fishing, and other work. Only a handful of able-bodied men remained, and the community feared what would happen as even those people disappeared. So the remaining islanders petitioned for the transfer. And eventually, the entire remaining community left. Not one family. Not one household. Everyone. Boreray was about to become empty. But that wasn't quite the end, because one family stayed behind for several more decades. And that detail changes the story. The evacuation in the 1920s didn't immediately erase every trace of human life. One family remained on Boreray. They held on for decades. But eventually, they left too. By the 1960s, Boreray had effectively become uninhabited. And now imagine the silence. A place that had once held more than 100 people, now had nobody. The crofts remained. The walls remained. The old paths remained. The fields remained. But the people were gone. And nature began taking back the spaces they had built. This is the part of Boraray's story that can be easy to overlook. When we see an abandoned building, We tend to think of it as a ruin. But a ruin is really a frozen moment in somebody else's life. Someone built that wall. Someone repaired that roof. Someone walked through that doorway. Someone probably sat inside that house during a storm. Someone looked out across the same ocean. Someone called this place home. And then they left. For decades, Boreray remained a kind of ghost island. But then something happened that nobody could have expected. In 1999, someone came back. The person who returned wasn't simply visiting Boreray. They came to rebuild. A crofter began restoration work on the island in 1999. And today, that crofter is described as Boreray's sole regular inhabitant. Think about the decision. You aren't moving into a town. You aren't buying a house on a quiet street. You're returning to an island that an entire community had abandoned decades earlier. You're surrounded by the remains of a previous way of life. And there is no neighborhood waiting for you. No row of houses. No village center. Just one croft. On an island that once supported around 20 crofts. The decision immediately creates a question. Why would somebody deliberately return to a place that everyone else had left? There are practical reasons. There is land. There is the croft. There is the possibility of working the island. There is a deep connection between crofting and the Hebrides. But there is something else. Something that statistics can't really explain. Attachment to place. Because Boreray isn't just a piece of land. It carries generations of history. And for someone willing to live there, the emptiness might not be the thing that makes the island special. It might be exactly the reason. When we hear the words, "the only person on an island," our imagination immediately goes to extremes. We imagine someone stranded, someone surviving, someone fighting the elements. But Boreray isn't a survivalist fantasy. It is a home. And that's an important distinction. The person living there isn't simply trying to survive until somebody comes to rescue them. This is a deliberate way of life. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, "Could you survive here?" we should ask, "Could you actually build a life here?" Because survival is one thing. Living is another. Living means waking up every morning and knowing that your routine depends on the landscape around you. The weather matters. The sea matters. The land matters. Animals matter. Supplies matter. Transport matters. And time itself feels different. In a city, inconvenience often means waiting 10 minutes. On an island like Boreray, the environment can determine what is possible. A storm isn't just bad weather. It can change your plans. A rough sea isn't simply unpleasant. It can affect access. And distance isn't measured only in kilometers. It's measured in conditions. That's the hidden reality of remote living. The map might tell you Boreray is only a couple of kilometers from North Uist. But the sea doesn't care what the map says. Look at Boreray from above. It doesn't appear enormous. In fact, it looks almost fragile. A small piece of land surrounded by the Atlantic. And that ocean creates the invisible boundary around the island. In everyday life, we barely think about distance. You walk outside. You get in a car. You drive somewhere. You buy what you need. You come home. Boreray strips away that convenience. There is no road connecting the island to the mainland. There isn't a town just beyond the next hill. There is simply water, and then another island, and then more water. That changes your relationship with everything. Food isn't simply something you pick up. Equipment isn't something you order and forget about. A repair isn't necessarily something a technician can handle immediately. A medical problem isn't something you solve by driving 10 minutes to a hospital. The ordinary systems that make modern life feel effortless become visible. Roads, ferries, electricity networks, water systems, supermarkets, hospitals, delivery trucks, cell towers, people, thousands of people working behind the scenes, so that we can live as though none of those things exist. On Boreray, you notice. Then there is the weather. The Outer Hebrides sit directly in the path of the Atlantic. The landscape is beautiful, but beauty doesn't make the weather gentle. Wind can sweep across the islands. Rain can arrive suddenly. The sea can turn rough, and storms can transform the landscape from peaceful to hostile in minutes. For someone living on Boreray, weather isn't simply something you check on your phone before deciding what jacket to wear. It can determine what work gets done, when you travel, when supplies can move, and when you simply stay inside. This is where the romantic image of remote island life starts to disappear. Because yes, there is extraordinary freedom. There is space. There is silence. There are views most people will never see. But the Atlantic doesn't care whether you find that beautiful. It doesn't negotiate, and neither does winter. Walk across Boreray today, and one of the strangest things isn't what you see. It's what you don't see. The island still contains evidence of its former inhabitants. Old crofting structures, stone walls, fields, remains of earlier settlements. A landscape shaped by people who are no longer here. And that is perhaps the most powerful way to think about Boreray. It's not empty. Not really. It is full of absence. Every wall suggests someone who once needed it. Every old field suggests work. Every ruined building suggests a family. Every path suggests movement. And somewhere in that landscape, there is a modern croft that is still alive. One of the old islands has, in a strange way, started breathing again. There is something almost poetic about the story. Boreray once had hundreds of people passing through its landscape. Then the population declined. People left. The final community was relocated. One family held on for decades. Then they left. The island fell silent. And after all of that, someone returned. Not to recreate the old community. Not to bring Boreray back to 180 people. Just to live there. One person. One croft. One island. It is almost the exact opposite of the way modern civilization normally grows. Cities become larger. Villages expand. Roads spread. Houses multiply. Boreray went in the opposite direction. 181 became 100. 100 became 50. 50 became a handful. A handful became 0. And then 0 became 1. That is an extraordinary demographic story. And it raises another question. Can a place survive with only one person? Maybe not in the same way a village survives. But perhaps survival doesn't always mean population growth. Perhaps sometimes it means someone simply refuses to let a place disappear completely. This is where the story becomes personal. Forget Boreray for a moment. Imagine your own life. You have a phone. internet, traffic, stores, restaurants, friends nearby, neighbors, noise, lights, thousands of people around you. Now imagine removing almost all of it. Would you feel free or trapped? Would the silence feel peaceful or frightening? Would you sleep better? Or would you start missing the sound of another human voice? Would you enjoy knowing that nobody can bother you? Or would you eventually give anything for someone to knock on the door? This is why Boreray is more interesting than simply being a remote island. The island forces us to think about something most of us rarely question. How much human contact do we actually need? Modern life assumes that more connection is better. More people, more communication, more entertainment, more convenience. Boreray asks a completely different question. What if less is enough? But there is another side. Freedom always has a price. On Boreray, that price is convenience. There is no anonymous crowd to disappear into. There is no easy escape from bad weather. There is no quick trip to a shop. There is no neighboring house where you can simply walk over for a conversation. And when something goes wrong, you cannot assume help is just around the corner. That means remote living requires planning, patience, practical skills, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to accept inconvenience. Because if you're going to live somewhere like Boreray, you have to stop expecting the world to adapt itself around you. You adapt to the island. That's the deal. The island gives you space. You accept distance. It gives you silence. You accept isolation. It gives you freedom. You accept responsibility. And perhaps that's why the people who choose remote places often describe them differently from the people who visit them. A tourist sees isolation. A resident may see home. And perhaps the most moving part of Boreray's story is that the person living there today isn't actually alone in the historical sense. Because the island is still populated by memory. The people who lived here before left their fingerprints everywhere. The crofts, the walls, the old fields, the traces of roads and drainage. The remains of a community that once depended on this landscape. Boreray's population reached around 181 in 1841. By the 20th century, economic conditions had become increasingly difficult. And in the 1920s, the remaining islanders were relocated. The Times 1925 report described 19 families, around 50 people, being resettled on North Uist. Imagine what that departure must have felt like. Packing your belongings, leaving the house where your family had lived, looking back at the island, knowing that the place you called home was about to become somebody else's history. Perhaps the strangest thing is that those people weren't simply disappearing. They carried Boreray with them. Their descendants continued elsewhere. Their memories continued, and the island remained behind, waiting. Today, Boreray has one regular inhabitant. That's the fact that brought us here. But after learning the island's history, the number suddenly feels different. At the beginning of this story, one person sounded strange, almost impossible. Now, it feels significant. Because one person isn't simply living on an empty island. One person is living among the remains of a community that once had families, children, workers, fishermen, farmers, neighbors, a community that eventually couldn't survive there. And yet, Boreray didn't completely disappear. Someone returned. Someone rebuilt. Someone decided that this tiny piece of land was still worth calling home. So would you live here? Not visit. Not spend a weekend. Not take a photograph and leave. Actually live here. Wake up to the Atlantic. Work the land. Watch the weather. Accept the distance. Know that the nearest crowd is somewhere else. And when the sun disappears behind the clouds, hear almost nothing but wind. For some people, that sounds like a nightmare. For others, it might sound like freedom. And perhaps that's the real mystery of Boreray. Not how one person can live alone on an island, but after an entire community left, someone looked at this place and decided to stay. Because Boreray isn't just a story about isolation. It's a story about attachment, about what makes a piece of land feel like home, and about the strange possibility that sometimes a place doesn't need hundreds of people to remain alive. Sometimes one person is enough.